Agile is the new standard for managing development teams and projects. It may be centered on developers, but the rest of us must still learn how to live with it. Our next speaker will tell us how. He's information architect at Normative Design and co-author of the upcoming book, Design for Understanding. Please welcome Karl Fast.
Good morning, everyone. This is a Zorgon. Now, you may not know what a Zorgon is. My 6-year-old does. A Zorgon is a half-man, half-reptile creature. They live in outer space, and they are very, very nasty. In the film Zathura, which is based on a book by the author of Jumanji, two little boys find a board game. They open up the box and they begin to play. And as they begin to play, their house lifts up from the earth and goes into outer space, and they have a space adventure which involves all kinds of different and dangerous and exciting things, including Zorgons. The Zorgons come, they attack the house, things are blowing up, and in the middle of all of this, an astronaut knocks on the door. Just clear out of the blue. They open the door quite hesitantly. The astronaut comes in, takes off his helmet, looks at them very closely, and says, as the Zorgons continue their attack and the lasers are going off and the house is exploding, "Looks like you got a pretty serious Zorgon problem." Now, we don't have a spaceship. We're not out in their space. But if we did, and if we were in Star Trek and we could go rocketing around the sun and we could go back in time about 20 years, we would find that the world of software development had their own Zorgon problem. And it looked like this. Most projects failed. Most projects were over budget. Those are pretty bad numbers. Imagine that you make coffee pots. 16% succeed. Right? You make cars. Most of them blow up. Right? This is a Zorgon problem. And developers were really concerned with it. Now, there are other numbers here. There are other studies and things which question these numbers and point to other things. But the basic point is that software development had a Zorgon problem, and it was bad. They were not able to deliver on some very basic fundamental promises, and yet it was hugely expensive and time-consuming. And you get things like healthcare.gov. Right? So why was there such a Zorgon problem for software? The key culprit that most people pointed their fingers at is the waterfall development. Right? We have our little villain here. And so the idea of the waterfall method is that when you develop software, it proceeds in a series of stages. And at each stage, you complete something and it just proceeds over the next level of the waterfall. And so you get from an idea, and then you get analysis, and then you get design, and then you get development, and then you get testing, and then, all right, we're ready to ship. Finally. Boom, 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 boom. This was the standard way that most software is developed. And while there were lots of different variations of it, waterfall was, and in some shops, many places still is, the dominant way that software happens. So you get a development cycle that looks like this, where you spend maybe 6 months planning, and then you spend a whole year writing code, and then you spend another 6 months going and testing and shipping and everything. And in the meantime, wow, the world really changes a lot in 2 years, doesn't it? So is it any wonder that software had a big Zorgon problem? Now that was probably a really good idea, or at least an acceptable way of doing things, when The digital world looked like this. And that's when I got started in software development. And while I'm not a developer anymore and haven't been for a long time, I remember those days well. I remember the days when 16 megabytes of RAM was a really big deal. Actually, I remember way before then too, but it's called gray in the beard. But in a day where everything looks like this, right, where we can deliver software updates over the wire or the wireless directly to the phone, we have moved into a new world of faster and iterative software development. Waterfall doesn't necessarily need to be the only way we do things. We can slay the Zorgon. So there were lots of ideas. I don't want to give you the impression that in the mid-90s or before that there were no ideas about how to do this, how to slay this Zorgon. There were quite a few different attempts to do this. They went for a variety of different names, but there was a watershed moment, and that watershed moment happened in 2001. A group of software developers got together in Utah for a meeting, and out of that came what we now call the Agile Software Manifesto. And if you haven't read it, you should take a look at it. It's not very long. What I'm going to do today is go through some parts of that manifesto, some key parts, and talk about how that relates to what you do, the work that you do in trying to create better user experiences, a better content strategy, run your website, and specifically how you can work with those teams, how you can take people who are enmeshed in the idea of agile development and understand their world, so that they can deliver their software better, but you can also achieve your goals in terms of that user-centered or human-centered process, that human-centered approach. Because in some respects, at the high level, there's a lot of similarities here. So, this is the big ideas for Agile. Individuals and interactions are valued over processes and tools. Working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this idea of following a plan. And so while they recognize that there is value all the way over here, they value the stuff that's all the way over here more. So these statements here, taken directly from the homepage of agilemanifesto.org, outline the basic idea of Agile. Now, there's a lot more to it, and we're going to get into just a little bit of that. Since then, we have seen in the last 14 years just this huge flourishing of Agile. There are books, there are podcasts, there are conferences, and there is the requisite really bad stock photography, which gets worse and worse. Now, I said that this was the main villain, right? The idea of the waterfall. But that's not the real villain in all this. The real villain, at least for those people who believe deeply in the Agile approach, the real villain is not so much waterfall as planning. Planning and planning and planning and planning. What they want to do is they want to write code, they want to iterate on that code, they want to move much faster. Planning takes a long time. So think about it this way. You have a child. I had one 6 years ago. He's delightful. This one, isn't he cute? Just fabulous. And you have so many big, grand ambitions for this child, right? You want this child to grow up. You want this child to do great and wonderful things. And the first thing you do is sit down and plan out how you are going to parent. And you spent, what, 6 months on it? A year? And developing a plan, and you're writing it all out, and you make all these different binders. And then parenting becomes the simple act of executing the plan. You follow the plan, right? Parents, that's what you do, right? Yeah. Not even close. It doesn't work like that. It's too complicated. You have ideas, so does your child. Things change, you adapt, and you evolve. The waterfall method would make no sense for parenting, and it doesn't make any sense for software either. That's the Agile argument. So what waterfall tries to do is separate planning from execution. First we plan, then we go ahead and we do everything else, right? Follow the plan, follow the plan. Agile doesn't try to separate them all at all. It integrates planning with execution. And you will sometimes, and well, often, read in some of the Agile literature quotes from famous generals, right? Like, no plan survives contact with the enemy, right? No plan, no software, no design survives contact with real users, right? No parent survives contact with actual children. The other way to think of it is, imagine that you wanted to sail across the ocean. You want to discover some new lands or build some new trade route. How do you do it? Well, the traditional classical European way would be to say, we are going to leave from Genoa, and we are going to go somewhere down here in the pagan land. Specifically, we are going to go here, and you draw a line and a few lines, and you follow the plan. And anything that happens along the way that kind of disrupts the plan, well, your main goal is to try to get back on the plan. Storms, get back on the plan. Just go straight through. But there is another way, isn't there? The other way is to say, well, we're kind of going to go in this direction. We're going to head over to those lands over there, but we're going to kind of follow the coast. And when we see a window of opportunity, maybe we're going to hop across to that particular island, and we're going to navigate, and we're going to evolve as we go. We have a general direction, right? We have a strategy, right? We're not completely clueless. We're not totally lost. But we recognize that plans change, right? We have to adapt. We have to evolve. We have to take advantage of opportunities. So when the Kraken arises out of the depths and begins chewing on the mainsail, we have some possible way of dealing with that rather than, oh my God, we've got to get back to the plan. There are exceptions to this, right? You want to go to the moon or Mars, you kind of have to really do a lot of planning in advance. Because if you make a mistake, you're in a big world of trouble. But most of the time, we're not dealing with something like that. So now, Agile here is not a process. It is really a reaction to the process. It's a reaction specifically to the methods or the process of the waterfall. But it itself is not a process, nor is it a technique or methods or tools, though there are lots of techniques that call themselves being about Agile. There are lots of methods, and there's a whole huge industry of companies which have sprung up to sell you tools, selling you this idea that if you buy our tool, then you will be Agile. So I'm not going to talk about tools or methods, but I want to make you understand that those are part of how you can achieve it, but they are not the idea itself. In fact, the idea of itself is what I showed you before and this. 12 principles. You can print out the entire thing on a page of paper, and that's it. And it doesn't even need to be double-sided. Everything that you have ever heard or may have heard about Agile comes down to this. Those 12, or how many people there were? I think it was 15 maybe. They got together in Utah, and they all had different ideas about what to do, different ideas about how to slay the software Zorgon. And they agreed on these 12 principles. So I want to go through a few of these. But from those principles, there's this huge industry, there's this huge sea change that's been happening in development, and as of 2010, Forrester Research found that about 35% of shops were now doing Agile, and some other work more recently has found that the number is much, much higher. I don't really care what the numbers are. The numbers aren't that important. The trend is clear. Mark Andreessen, known for developing Mosaic, the first graphical web browser, and now as a big venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, Andreessen Horowitz, likes to say that software is eating the world. We are just putting software into everything. Right? Your car is software. Right? Books are software. It's not just computers and smartphones, it's everything. But if software is eating the world, then it's really clear that Agile is eating software development. So, whether you're a developer or not, how many people here, just out of curiosity, are developers? Okay, so some of you are. Of those of you who are developers, how many of you are in an Agile shop? Okay, so that means almost all of you, right? The rest of you, how many of you, in order to achieve what you want to do, need to work with developers? I'm going to guess most of you, right? So, there's a group of people that you need to work with, and their world is being transformed by that one word, Agile. It is probably the single biggest thing that has transformed software in the last 15 years. Open source probably being a close number 2, and for developers in the room, right, Stack Overflow would be number 3. So even if you're not a developer, you need to learn to live with Agile because it is affecting how your work is going to get completed, how your design is going to become imagined in the world, how it's become real. So I want to go through 5 ideas here about how you can approach the new Agile world. And the first thing I think you should do is you should understand intent. I've already spoken about this to some extent, but let me tell you another story. Shortly before the Agile Manifesto happened, I moved to Vancouver and joined a startup. And it was your classic kind of startup, which means we had big ideas. And we were founded by someone who was really smart and wanted to get really rich and was a real jerk. To give you a sense of what a kind of a jerk this person was, he had, shall we say, well, I was going to say a bad day, but perhaps a typical day would be more like it. And we had moved into new offices, and we were the second most trafficked website in the province of British Columbia at the time. We had a large server room with big glass walls. It would be at least the width of this stage and probably longer. And he came in late at night, and he was upset. And he looked at the rack of servers, and he looked at the person who was responsible for putting these all together, and he says, "You are an idiot." I'm using much nicer language than he actually used. "You are an idiot. Everybody knows you run the network cables down the left side of the rack, not the right side of the rack." And he picked up a screwdriver and began unscrewing live servers from the racks at 11 o'clock at night. It was a really unpleasant place to work. Some nice people, smart people, but that one person sort of made a very, not sort of, definitely made a very toxic culture. So I called my former boss, because I'd been there about a week, and she says, "Well, either get out now, get out really fast, or if you decide to stick it out for a while, which I can understand since you just moved 1,700 kilometers, I'm going to recommend you buy this book." Now, the key, and I'm going to recommend this book to you as well. It doesn't really matter where you work. Because this book argues that the first thing to do is understand that everybody works from positive intent, from their perspective. Everybody has positive intent, right? I'm not sure if they go so far as to say that Hitler had positive intent, but they basically argue that nobody has, right? There are very few, if any, truly evil people in the world. From their perspective, once you understand it, they have positive intent. And positive intent doesn't necessarily mean somebody walking in and unscrewing live racks from the server. That was about control, right? That was about someone, I need to make sure that everybody understands that I have the authority. And from his perspective, that was important. Yeah, you ever work with someone who is maybe the opposite of that? They're a really nice person, they're not kind of a jerk, but they like to say yes to everything. And if you say yes to everything, right, because they want to please you, they want to make you happy, what happens next? They can't deliver on anything. People you can't stand, right? Now, maybe they're overstating the point a bit here, but it gives you a useful framework for looking at positive intent. Agile comes from the idea of a positive intent. Let's change the way that software developers work so that we can change those horrible, horrible numbers and slay the Zorgon. And the first principle in the Agile manifesto is this: our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Okay. What is, however, the customer? Agile people talk about customers. They don't always talk about users. Sometimes they talk about stakeholders. They can get these confused quite easily. If you're coming from user experience, it's pretty clear, right? These distinctions are much more clear. Agile can sometimes get confused about this. This is partly because some of the Agile processes were originally developed for, say, in-house projects, where the customer and the user could be easily conflated, and it was the person in the cubicle next to you. Okay. The other thing that happens here is that Agile methods, because they argue that plans are a waste of time up front, right? What they do is they think that they can easily fall into the trap of thinking that there is no point in doing any planning. There is no point in doing any sort of research. And as those of you who've done user research know, that can take a little bit more than a week, right? To find something really useful that you can actually do something about, right? So the idea here is that oftentimes, from the big picture perspective, a lot of user work is quite stable. It doesn't change dramatically over time. The tools and technologies will change, right? But the work itself and what needs to be done does not change. And there are some fundamental truths that our research can reveal that would have a long-term impact. Right? If you're interested, I would definitely recommend the User-Centered Agile Methods book by Hugh Beyer. It's an excellent book for anyone who comes from a user experience background. It talks about where Agile comes from, and it talks about UX leverage points and how you can take a lot of things that you will hear when you're working with Agile developers and introduce methods and perspectives and techniques from the UX world. And it offers a lot of specific advice about particular methods in the second half of the book. Now, one of the intentions that developers also have is to reduce risk. Because risk looks like this in 1994. And that is not acceptable. How can one change those numbers? How can one reduce risk? So when developers talk about the great risk, in the old world, they meant something like, how do we avoid problems associated with this? And building these large cathedrals, while at the same time, avoiding this. Because when you hear about Agile methods and how they move in 2-week sprints or 1-week sprints and they do daily builds, very different from the waterfall method. And you're hearing about they don't plan, you might think, wow, we're going to wind up with the shanty town and everything is piecemeal. And as Ellen Ullman wrote a long time ago about programming, the problem with computers is that we build them the way we build our cities, over time and without a plan on top of ruins. And she wrote this before the Agile manifesto. So there's a fundamental tension here, right, between the need to plan, but the need to iterate, the need to do a lot of thinking up front, but the need to be really focused and flexible and adaptive. Okay? One of the other principles in the manifesto then becomes deliver working software frequently from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference for the shorter time scale. And in fact, there are some shops which do it even more than that. They will do what they call sprints or iterations, which may be a week or several weeks, typically no more than a month, but they will do daily builds, right? So they'll build up their software, and it is not uncommon for some places to push live new code to the server once a day, every day, or sometimes multiple times per day. And in 1994, that was total crazy talk. Today, in some shops, that is just taken for granted. But it comes from that place of positive intent to reduce risk around that highest priority of meeting the needs of the customer. And they use a whole bunch of different techniques. So if you work with Agile developers, or you are ever connected with an Agile shop, they'll talk about things like Kanban boards and WIP limits or work in progress limits, sprints, stand-up meetings, daily builds. And in the user experience world, we often talk about things like sketching and guerrilla or discount usability testing, heuristic evaluations, and card sorting and affinity models. These are also methods around reducing risk. And they are relatively simple, relatively quick, relatively inexpensive. But they don't always have any purchase within the world of the Agile shop, within the minds of the Agile developers. But there are ways in which they can align nicely because they are about reducing risk and working quickly. So, we have this idea of a villain, that plans are a bad idea, but as Dwight Eisenhower famously said, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. And if we do that in the right way, the villain can disappear. It's also important, I feel, to respect the practice, to respect what developers are going through. Agile has transformed. People walk in every day to an Agile shop, and they are not doing the same things that they used to do. Their basic behaviors, the basic habits, the basic culture is fundamentally different. You can't walk in and say, I think you need to change all that. Because the change you just did over the last 2 years to get this going, yeah, let's change that even more. You do want to evolve it and work with them to do this, but don't disrespect what they have been going through. Another principle they have, the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. So a common practice that you will see, probably the most common practice you will see in any place that is even somewhat agile, is the stand-up meeting. You may do this yourself even in your own place, even if you don't work with developers, if you're not part of a development team at all. The stand-up meeting. Now, the stand-up meeting specifically within the context of Agile means a daily time that is consistent every day. The developers in that team, which is usually going to be a small team, 15 would be a high number of people for this, will get together and they will stand up, hence the name, and they will not give a status report. In an ill-functioning team, they're giving status reports. What they're doing instead is they are doing 3 things. 1, they are going to state their accomplishments. This is what I did yesterday since the last time we had a stand-up. 2, I am committing to achieving this today. And 3, these are the roadblocks that I have. These are the things that I potentially expect will cause me problems. People don't ask questions. You do this in 1 minute, and then any other discussion should happen offline after the meeting, right, to dig deeper one-on-one and other things. The stand-up is really common. Now, I'm sure that the world might be a little different if other places use stand-ups. And there's an old story that developers like to tell about a pig and a chicken open a restaurant. And the chicken says, I think we should serve bacon and eggs. And the pig says, I'm not sure I really like that idea because I'm going to be really committed, but you're just involved. When it comes to stand-up meetings, and the idea of this, the idea is to express commitment. This is what I commit to doing. Right? I am going to achieve this today. The mind of the developer gets narrowed right down to this day. And the team is working in these iterations that are this week or these 2 weeks. And that can play a lot of havoc with a user experience team that wants to go out and do 2 months of field research. Well, maybe not 2 months, but you gotta go and recruit people, and you gotta schedule stuff, and you gotta gather the data, and you gotta analyze the interviews, or you gotta work through the videos. How do you do that? The first place you gotta start is to respect the practice. Don't tell them that you know better, right? And then try to connect with it from there. Commit to the team. And when I say that, and respect the practice, and one of the things that you should not do here, connecting to the practice, is walk in and sit down. Which seems really obvious, doesn't it? It's called a stand-up. But it happens all the time. There's all kinds of stories on blogs and in podcasts about people doing this. Say like the manager from some other group coming in and sitting down at the stand-up. And what does that say? I'm from the outside and your rules don't apply to me. And I'm special. Right? And it's kind of hard to get respect from developers when you're sitting down at their stand-up. Simple things like that can make a difference here because their world has been just upended. And they are trying to figure out how to make Agile work. Okay. They're trying to figure this out as well. So this is an opportunity for you to try to figure out how it can align with what you're doing. And then you can evolve what's happening, but from an understanding of the intent. And when you do that, you want to align with the cadences. Cadence is a word that developers will often talk about because they move at something that is so different from the waterfall. The cadence or the rhythm. This is a word that one of the developers at Normative, where I work, talks about. In the manifesto, welcome the changing requirements because even late in development, Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. And this cadence can be faster, like I said, 1 week, 2 weeks, than you might be used to. Let me explain a little bit what I mean by this, or the consequences of this, by showing you a famous picture of a famous man. This is the picture of Steve Jobs from Time magazine when the Macintosh was released. And for many years, for decades, this was one of the most iconic pictures of Steve Jobs. And it says something, I think, interesting about the man and our image of him, but also of Apple and computing as a whole. Minimalist. Organized. Clean. Right? In control. And if this is one of the more famous pictures of Steve Jobs, an iconic picture that I think in many ways captures sort of the essence of what Apple tries to project, this is my favorite. This is Steve Jobs at home. And you may notice something a little different. Right? This is what I would just call as mess. And the other word for that is reality. And Agile is trying to accept that this is the reality of making software. This is the reality of building new and interesting things. And that this is not the way the world is. This is not the way digital works. It works like this. Right? And so Agile is trying to accept this and build a practice, build a culture, build habits, build routines around this reality. Okay. So when you can align with that cadence, it means aligning something with not is only iterative, that is not only focused, but it is also fundamentally messy. And when you walk into a group of Agile developers, you're going to see this. This is the board, right? And the board has sticky notes, and you've got things like the to-dos, and you've got next, and you've got the work in progress, ready for test, and you've got stuff scribbled all over the place, and I don't even know what that is, and it's messy, and it's how it works. Now, once you've done that, you also want to look at closing the feedback loops. And this is where developers, in my experience, are more likely to have problems than other places. Right? This is, I think, is a hook, a touch point where you can begin to say quite clearly, we can help with this. I've got a user-centered approach. I've got user-centered methods and techniques. Here's where I can connect with you. The Agile Manifesto says, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. You can unpack that for them. What do we mean by the customer? Give them that more nuanced picture. Speak their language and expand. Right? Customers, users, stakeholders, and within each of those, you can be more nuanced as well. At Normative, we had a project where, so one of the big changes that we've had at Normative Design since we started, we used to be a traditional studio. That studio did things like wireframes and mock-ups, right? Prototypes, user research, usability. So we would do the discovery, we would do the design, we would do the validation. Over the last couple of years, we've built up a large group of people in the company who are also software developers. And one of the major reasons is because we believe that software is eating the world, and that's going to be important for doing the next generation of design. It also helps us work well with our clients. So we have developers who are embedded in clients, who work alongside their developers, who have an office. They have a desk in their offices, as well as working at our studio. And one of the things that we've discovered is a few times we've gone in and they're like, this is an Agile shop, and they're like, yes, and we're closing the feedback loop with the customers, but the customer turns out to be just the business stakeholders and not users. And in one case, we had a group, they were working for an entire year in an Agile fashion, where they were doing daily builds and 2-week sprints, but for a whole year, all they did was demos to the business people in the organization and not to users. So the positive intent got derailed because they had a misunderstanding of how rich this is. My background is a lot more with interaction design, and I tend to speak more about the future of interaction design for a world of ubiquitous computing, where computing is bled into everything. And one of the things I like to show is how a little picture of how the computer conceptualizes us as the user. We have a finger, right? We have an eye, ears, a mouth. This is changing a little bit. I should probably draw in a little mouth now because we have voice commands. But we have, really, my arms and my legs and my body basically disappears. Right? What's your understanding of developers? Do you have a good, clear picture of them? Do you have a good, clear picture that goes beyond this? If you don't have that picture, right, we recognize that to do good design, we need to have a better picture than this. Right? We need to have a richer picture of our users, and we also need to have a richer picture of developers and what they do and how they are trying to do it and why. Software is eating the world, and Agile is eating their world. So, to deal with that, align with the cadence, with respect for the practice, to reduce risk from an understanding of intent and help them close those feedback loops. And then from there, you can work to create the change from your perspective around user experience. And if you can do that, then you can slay that Zorgon. Thank you.